Hi friends, welcome to Chapter 2, What Constitutes Persuasion? In this presentation, we'll cover the distinguishing factors between pure and borderline persuasion. We'll also address some of the limiting factors or criteria when trying to define persuasion. We'll look at the role of context as it relates to persuasion, and then we'll explore some theories and models that explain, to a certain extent, the process of persuasion. So let's go ahead and get started. Pure versus borderline persuasion. We know that persuasion is all around us and it's pervasive. It's everywhere. But sometimes we aren't always aware of the persuasion that takes place around us. And so to provide a better understanding of persuasion, there are really two ways to look at persuasion: pure persuasion and borderline persuasion. Pure persuasion are those explicit attempts to persuade, influence, or gain compliance. These are the clear-cut cases of persuasion. So you might think of a lawyer trying to convince the jury to decide on a particular verdict. That is a very intentional, explicit attempt to persuade, influence, or gain compliance. Think about the advertisements that you're exposed to on a daily basis, right? These are pure persuasive attempts. However, the way we interact with people in everyday situations, whether we realize it or not, might have a persuasive effect on the people we interact. And this is borderline persuasion. Borderline persuasion includes the implicit communication, the persuasive attempts, or it could include low-level awareness that persuasion is taking place. It could be the effects of communication on a subconscious level. And oftentimes, borderline communication is too subtle to recognize them as persuasive attempts. So think about maybe your nonverbal behavior. You dress a particular way, you present yourself a particular way in order to maybe influence the way people see you, or as a form of self-expression. Whether we recognize it or not, these types of behaviors, such as what we wear in terms of clothing, may have a persuasive effect on the people around us. You know, that's why I don't show up to class as an instructor, as a professor, wearing my pajamas, because to a certain extent, I'm trying to influence or persuade the audience to view me in a particular light. So think about maybe your nonverbal behavior and how that could be a form of borderline persuasion, where it's implicit. People aren't necessarily aware that your behavior, what you wear, is having an influence or some sort of effect on them. So these are the distinguishing factors between pure and borderline persuasion. To get even deeper, we could look at some of these factors that play into this distinction between pure and borderline persuasion. We could look at the number of communicators involved. So oftentimes, pure persuasion is an explicit, it's an intentional act that we as a communicator engage in with another person or persons. So pure persuasion tends to be interpersonal, whereas borderline persuasion tends to be intrapersonal, residing within oneself. We see that pure persuasion is also intentional. Oftentimes, when we engage in pure persuasion, we're very intentional on the communication that we use in order to generate the desired results. However, borderline persuasion is often unintentional. We aren't really conscious about how our communication is influencing other people. Pure persuasion is effective. Borderline persuasion is ineffective. We also see that pure persuasion is symbolic in nature, whereas borderline persuasion is not really symbolic. We see that pure persuasion, there's a sense of awareness. The people communicating, sending that persuasive message, and the people receiving that persuasive messages are aware that some sort of persuasion is trying to take place. Borderline persuasion, typically both parties are unaware. And then we also see that pure persuasion uses ethical means to persuade, whereas borderline persuasion, because of the lack of awareness, might include some ethical forms of persuasion. So now that we know the distinguishing factors between pure persuasion and borderline persuasion, now we can jump into some limiting criteria we experience when trying to define persuasion. The book talks about 5 limiting criteria: intentionality, the effects, free will, conscious awareness, symbolic action, and also the interpersonal versus intrapersonal dynamics. So let's go ahead and go through each one of these. Some definitions look at intentionality as a defining characteristic of persuasion. Some scholars argue that persuasion has to be intentional. So their definitions often conceptualize persuasion by focusing on intentionality. However, this is limiting in a variety of different ways. First, humans are not always intentional with persuasion, influence, and compliance gaining. Another reason why this is a limiting criteria is due to Bandura's social learning modeling theory, which suggests that naturally we observe other people behaving and we imitate behavior that has been rewarded, and we do not model behavior that is punished. So think about how maybe unintentionally parents might model behavior by just doing what they're doing with their children. So parents often model behavior to their children simply by carrying on like normal. Oftentimes, parents might not even be aware that this modeling is taking place. Think about, in last lecture, I talked about entertainment education, how character developments or characters, their behavior that we see on our favorite Netflix show, if there is a parasocial relationship between this character and the audience, chances are the audience, to a certain extent, are going to model the behavior of their favorite celebrity. We also see that sometimes persuasion and influence has a negative effect. This is also taken into consideration by the Archie Bunker effect. So Archie Bunker was a fictional TV character in a show back in 1970. And Archie Bunker was kind of a bigot. He was a blue-collar working class type of individual, rough around the edges, and the audience members identified with him. They could relate with him, and so they often started modeling some of those negative qualities or characteristics in this entertainment character, this television character. So obviously the producers, the creators of this show, that was not their intention. They were trying to create a juxtaposition between, a character that they wanted to model good behavior, and then Archie Bunker, who was supposed to illustrate kind of these negative qualities. But the audience actually were persuaded more by the Archie Bunker character. And so they named this the Archie Bunker effect, where audiences persuaded unintentionally. So we can take a look at intentionality and see some of the limiting criteria as it relates to defining persuasion. Another common component of all sorts of different definitions we experience are the effects. So effects conceptualize persuasion by focusing on outcomes rather than the process of persuasion. This has a variety of limiting qualities that we'll explore. First, even poor persuasive attempts that contribute to little to no effect is still a persuasive message. So think about communication, for example. Even though that maybe someone doesn't have strong communication skills, they're still communicating. So while, yes, we typically look at the effects of a persuasive message to determine the effectiveness, it doesn't mean that just because there was no effect, that no persuasion took place. Looking at this quality or characteristic of defining persuasion often takes a very limited linear view that does not take into consideration the mutual or reciprocal process of persuasion. So persuasion is a mutual process where if I'm going to be persuading you, you have to be open to that process, right? In order to be an effective persuader, I have to be open to being persuaded and influenced by you. It's a mutual give and take relationship. So, with taking this approach, the effects approach, it's setting it up in a very linear fashion where you have the message, the sender, the channel, whatever, persuasion takes place, and then the desired effect, right? Simplistically, it conceptually, it helps us make sense of it, but it's limiting in the fact that it doesn't take into consideration the complexities of persuasion. Also, there's a lot of difficulties measuring direct effects of persuasion due to mediating variables. So think about how, all sorts of different variables influence a persuasive attempt. So social media addiction may be mediated by loneliness. So that means that, individuals who are more lonely are going to probably experience more social media addiction because they're on social media longer, trying to fulfill some sort of emotional closeness, right? So we could look at social media addiction as a mediating factor, or vice versa. We could look at loneliness as a mediator of social media use and social media addiction. Think about attachment styles, needs for validation, boredom, anxiety, all of these other variables that might contribute to the overall effect, right? So there's a lot of different variables that play into what makes something persuasive. And at the end of the day, again, as we talked about in chapter 1, persuasion is a science and an art. There's stuff we are still trying to learn about persuasion. So there are some limiting factors to looking at the effects component in defining persuasion. We also could look at free will and conscious awareness. Some scholars argue that free will and conscious awareness are critical components to ethical persuasion. So they often conceptualize persuasion by focusing on mindfulness, awareness, and freedom to accept or reject persuasive messages. While, their intentions are good in trying to conceptualize and define persuasion using free will and conscious awareness, the fact is that, it assumes that persuasion requires an atmosphere of free choice. So taking a look, looking at this from a deterministic approach, think to yourself, how much free will and free choice do you actually have in life? How much of your life, the choices that you're making, the behavior that you're engaged in, has been predetermined for you, simply based on external factors? So it assumes that we have complete free choice over every aspect of life, and that's just simply not the case. Second, it's really difficult to clearly differentiate persuasion from coercion. Coercion can involve positive inducements, incentives, and not just negative sanctions. We see that most influence attempts contain both persuasive and coercive features. The degree of coerciveness is largely in the eyes of the beholder. We also see that some definitions focus on the symbolic action of persuasion. And this conceptualized persuasion by focusing on language as a symbolic action. Essentially, it's looking at persuasion from a semiotics perspective, which studies the signs and symbols that people use in order to communicate. So we see that signs and symbols are persuasive, but this is also limiting because it limits persuasion to one sensory experience of a message. So, language, while it's very important, might not be the only sensory experience of persuasion. So visually, we look at people's nonverbal behavior. We see the visual aesthetics of maybe an advertisement or commercial. The auditory sensory, right? We hear music. We know that certain types of music can influence the moods people feel or the emotions people feel. So again, there's a lot more to persuasion than just the linguistic aspect. Nonverbal cues contain persuasive potential. So we see that physical attributes, such as perceived level of attractiveness and also source credibility, are really important to persuasion. Research has documented over and over and over that physical attributes, perceived level of attractiveness is a persuasive component. We're typically more likely to assign attractive people higher levels of credibility than maybe what they really deserve. So think of how nonverbal cues have persuasive potential. It also, excludes non-symbolic features that affect persuasive outcomes. So again, we see that only focusing on the language could be a limiting factor. Now, some definitions use this interpersonal, messages between two people as a defining characteristic. So they conceptualize persuasion by focusing on interpersonal dyadic, such as two distinctions, how many people are involved, and so forth. And while there is validity to this argument or using this characteristic or this criteria, to a certain extent, persuasion could be a dance between two people. So we do recognize that. But persuasion is often an intrapersonal process through our thought rationalization. So it's, your ability to be persuaded is contingent on whether you allow yourself to be persuaded. It's the internal motivation, being open. It's the internal justification that we use that often leads to persuasion, right? So last summer, I bought a new car. My old car, it still worked fine. It still got me to work. But after, working remotely during the last 2 years of the pandemic, getting back into the classroom in the fall, I thought, it would be really cool to buy a new car. So I went through deep thinking on figuring out, do I need a new car? I'm a very frugal person as it is. If something's not broken, it's why would you buy a new thing, right? So it took me a while to rationalize or justify myself buying a new car, but that level or that persuasion was all up here. It didn't matter if I saw a car commercial. It didn't matter if I was exposed to this type of information. What really mattered was that I was open to the idea of buying a new car, and that opened up, my ability to be influenced. So the book, after discussing these limiting criteria, the book provides this definition of persuasion. Persuasion involves one or more persons who are engaged in the activity of creating, reinforcing, modifying, or extinguishing beliefs, attitudes, intentions, motivations, and or behaviors with the constraints of a given communication context. So essentially, this is all-encompassing definition, but it's essentially using whatever means possible in a given situation in order to persuade a person. So now that we know a little bit about persuasion and how to define it, and some of the limiting criteria that make it difficult for scholars to explore persuasion, let's take a look at the context of persuasion. So in essence, the context determines the nature of the persuasion process that is operating, linear, two-way, or even delayed. So essentially, the context determines the nature of persuasion. Context-based factors that affect the nature of persuasion process include the following: the number of communicators, right? So the more people that we have engaged in persuasion, the more likely we're going to fall into this group think. Whether communication is synchronous or asynchronous. So are we allowing our audience time to process the information? Typically, if you're in a dyadic, real-time, synchronous communication context, people don't really have the luxury of time to really digging deep in people's arguments and determining the validity of the information that they're sharing. Whereas in this video, you could pause, you could research this stuff, you could read up on different contexts, and then you could determine after, having the luxury of time to see whether or not this message is persuasive or, that I have source credibility. The ratio between verbal and nonverbal cues that are present. So think about how, again, this mediated environment is so limiting. I can't determine your nonverbal response or the feedback that maybe you're giving off during this lecture. I don't have access to that information. So really, I don't know if I'm being persuasive or not. So think about the verbal, nonverbal cues that are present, and this could be the sensory data and stimuli, and how that may influence the type of persuasion we engage in. We could also look at the nature and type of media. Postman wrote one of his great works, Amusing Ourselves to Death, in 1982, where he had this quote: "Form excludes the content. The form excludes the content." And that is saying essentially that the form communication takes place, places certain limitations on what we can talk about and communicate. So this is diving deeper into a statement that was made by Marshall McLuhan, who is, again, an earlier media ecologist. And he had the provocative saying that the medium is the message. So the medium, how we communicate, tells us more about society and people than what is actually communicated on that medium. So think about the television, for example. A lot of people who are critical of television, will point to trash TV and the violence and the sex and just, all of these, horrible things on the television. Say, look what the television is doing. According to McLuhan and Postman and other media ecologists, that stuff doesn't really matter. What matters is the actual medium of television. What is that doing to society as a whole, right? What is that doing to us as communicators? Walter Ong, another prolific media ecologist, really focused at exploring the distinction between primary oral cultures and literate cultures. So literacy is a form of communication. When we can write, we can express ourselves in so many new, interesting ways than we could if we were operating in a primary oral culture that did not have any written formal language. So Walter Ong makes the argument that, think of history, for example. If we lived in a primary oral culture, we couldn't write down any of our history. Oftentimes we relied on narratives, storytelling. If we lived in a tribe that only spoke language, we didn't have any writing, then there would be storytellers, the historians, that would have to memorize vast amounts of information. So think about, again, memory and history, right? So once we made that transition from primary oral cultures into writing, now we could transcribe or essentially take the ideas, our thoughts, the history, all that knowledge in our minds and record it on a piece of paper or a stone tablet. So by doing that, we freed up a lot of space in our cognition to explore other things, right? As a result, though, because we didn't have to memorize a bunch of stuff, we became lazy. So I write a ton of stuff, but do I remember everything verbatim what I write? No, in fact, I don't. That's why I write it down. So, think of like the nature, the type of media, and how that influences the content that we can communicate, and how that influences persuasion, right? This is going to be really important as we progress in the semester, because if you're trying to persuade someone who is intellectually invested in a particular argument, maybe writing out an argument or a persuasive message might be more effective than trying to flash an image and use music. That might be effective to people who could care less about the message, who are going to be more in tune to the emotional appeals used as a form of persuasion. So again, we'll explore that a little bit later in this presentation. Another context is the goals of the participants. So, what is the goal of the people participating? Is it self-presentational goals? Are there relational goals? So, even though you are trying to influence the other person, maybe you're concerned more with harmony in the relationship, or are there instrumental goals that are part of that context? We could also look at the social cultural factors that shape participants' message, construction, and perceptions. So we see that in different cultures, people use different forms of persuasion. In a Western low context culture, direct persuasion or direct communication is very common. However, if you're from a high context culture, or we see, in Eastern cultures, they tend to use very subtle cues when communicating. They aren't very direct in their communication. The idea is that because there's a lot of shared context, like everyone knows kind of the how to interpret messages, then they tend to be very indirect. So we could even look at cultural context as a mediating factor of persuasion. So let's take a look at two theories that explains the process of persuasion. The first one is the Elaboration likelihood model developed by Patty and Cacioppo. And this theory takes into account how communicators process persuasive messages. So essentially, when people are exposed to persuasive messages, they either engage in elaborate way, such as critical thinking, or they use less elaboration and passively assess a persuasive message. So let's break this down a little bit. Elaboration essentially includes the level of critical engagement with a particular message. So how likely are people going to critically engage with a particular message? That's essentially what elaboration is. Now, there are two ways, according to this model, that people respond to persuasive messages. The first one is through this central route. People who use the central route to process new information engage in critical thinking and evaluate persuasive messages are often intrigued or invested in the message itself. And so they typically tend to be more engaged, and they weigh new information against information they already know. So if you're, let's say, a photographer and you want to buy the best camera on the market, right? Because you have, let's say, a passion, a really strong interest in photography, you're going to be more engaged with persuasive advertisements about photography or a camera. You're going to do your research. You're going to know the ins and outs of your industry. And so when you're exposed to a persuasive message, you're going to probably use the central route. You're going to really focus in and critically assess that persuasive message. However, for some of us who maybe aren't really interested in photography at all, or when we're presented with a persuasive message and we could really care less about the topic or what the message is about, we often will engage in this peripheral route. People who use the peripheral route are often not fully engaged in critical thinking and evaluate the persuasive message based on simple cues such as how credible the source is, how likability or likability or the emotional appeal is used. So if I don't know anything really about photography, I could really care less about getting the best camera. I might be engaged in this peripheral route where I'm not as critical to those persuasive messages, and I might rely on subtle cues like, well, I guess it was, it's a camera from Sony. I guess they're a good brand, so I'll be persuaded by that. Or likability, maybe people buy a car because how it looks, and that's about it. Or emotional appeals, right? So the key takeaway is that when we're trying to craft a persuasive message, we want to know our audience. We want to activate that central route, right? Because we know that when people are invested in our message or in our topic, they're going to give that message more attention, more energy, and if that persuasion is effective, that leads to lasting change. So here's a very simplistic model that demonstrates these two processes. You have a persuasive message. If the audience is motivated to pay attention because maybe this topic or this message is relevant to them, they're going to be motivated and analytical. They're going to engage in that high elaboration, that processing. They're going to put high effort into evaluating the message. And if their evaluations are favorable, and leads to persuasion, that's going to contribute to this lasting change in attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors. However, persuasive message, if the audience members are, could care less about, again, the topic, they might not be motivated to give the energy in assessing that message. And so typically they're not even analytical. They're going to put in minimal effort in determining, the validity of that persuasive message. So they're using low elaboration or this low processing, low effort. If they're going to be persuaded by a persuasive messages, they're going to look outside cues of the message. How did it make me feel? What's my current mood? Was there cool music? Or was it visually stimulating? Right? And if persuasion happens based off of those outside cues, this only really leads to temporary change in attitudes, a temporary change in beliefs, limited influence and compliance gaining. So again, the idea is to assess your message and tailor it to the audience's motivations. Because if you can do that, then chances are you can engage them in this high elaboration. And if you're effective at what you do, this could lead to lasting change. Another model that kind of takes this dual approach, where they assume that there's two routes to processing persuasive messages and regular messages, is the Heuristic-Systematic Model. And this provides another useful model of how persuasion occurs. So it's very similar to the Elaboration likelihood model in that there's two primary routes that we use. Systematic processing, which is thoughtfulness and deliberate engagement with messages, and then heuristic processing, which relies on the application of mental shortcuts, right? So you'll notice that the differences here. So those shortcuts that we often use include maybe quality of proof, credibility, simplifying the thought process. So people who use this kind of heuristic processing relies on these mental shortcuts that allow them to make a decision fairly quickly. We could also look at decision rules, such as brand loyalty, to simplify the decision-making process. So this relates to also a sufficiency principle. This is essentially gathering enough information to make an informed decision. Now, we all approach persuasion or decision-making differently, and we all have different thresholds on how much information we need in order to make a decision that we're happy with. This also relates to motivation and ability, time and energy, exposure to messages. So if we don't have a lot of time to read a ton of articles on photography or vaccines or, the health complications or the risks associated with them, or, both sides of the argument, with vaccine hesitancy, if we don't have a lot of time to investigate and dive into that literature, right, we might not really engage in this systematic processing route, right? We might be less deliberate with our persuasive messages. So if the CDC comes out and says, hey, do this, we take that mental shortcut, we look at the CDC and say, okay, it's a credible institution. I don't have the time to go read every medical research paper there is about, vaccines. So I'm going to be more persuaded through this heuristic processing route. So again, you can see kind of, the similarities with the Elaboration likelihood model in terms of using that central peripheral route. The key difference is, though, I think that instead of just relying on external cues, we rely on the heuristic kind of characteristics. So these are the cognitive shortcuts that we often engage in. Okay, so in chapter 2, it covers a lot. We talked about pure and borderline persuasion, how pure persuasion are those explicit attempts to persuade, influence, gain compliance. We also talked about borderline persuasion, which are kind of the implicit, low level of awareness type persuasive messages. We talked about in section 2 some limiting criteria. It's difficult to conceptualize and define persuasion. And just like anything in life, if we use one definition, we have to figure out what that criteria is going to be, because that criteria we use to define something is going to place limitations on what is persuasion and what's not persuasion. So we talked about some limiting criteria. We talked about the role of context in persuasion. And then we looked at these dual process models, the Elaboration likelihood model, that people who are motivated tend to engage in this central route of processing a persuasive messages. Those who are unmotivated or maybe aren't interested, they're going to be persuaded by peripheral cues. We also looked at the Heuristic-Systematic Model, which is very similar, that people who are invested, they're motivated, they're going to use that systematic process to persuasion where they're going to gather the information, make it a well-informed decision for themselves. Whereas those who maybe don't have the luxury of time or energy, they're more likely to take these mental shortcuts and look at things such as source credibility. So thank you so much for participating in Chapter 2, and we'll see you next time.